California 1987. Inside the prison cell, no inmate survived longer than 72 hours. True crime documentary. If you think you've seen dark prison stories before, hit subscribe, like, and drop a comment, because this one doesn't blink. The emergency call came in just before dawn, when the prison was at its quietest and the guards' nerves were stretched thin by fatigue. A correctional officer stood frozen outside segregation cell 9, staring through reinforced glass at something that made him forget his training. The cell was empty. The inmate inside had been transferred in less than 48 hours earlier, part of a routine disciplinary move that barely raised an eyebrow. Now his bedding was untouched, the metal sink dry, the air inside the cell humming faintly as if the walls themselves were still awake. But the inmate was gone. Not escaped. Not transferred. Just gone. Within minutes, the corridor filled with senior staff, radios murmuring in tight, controlled voices. The prison administrator ordered the wing sealed. No movement. No speculation. The official report would come later. For now, they needed answers. Segregation Cell 9 had a reputation that stretched back decades. Older officers whispered about it during night shifts. Inmates avoided it in conversations that stopped the moment staff walked by. It wasn't violent. It wasn't haunted. It didn't need to be. No inmate had stayed inside longer than 72 hours. Most requested removal sooner. A few begged. One collapsed during intake and never returned to general population. The reason, officially, was environmental malfunction. But no one ever explained what that really meant. Evelyn Cross, an internal investigator with a background in facility safety violations, arrived that morning carrying a thin folder and a heavy sense of unease. She had been assigned to review Cell 9 before, twice in fact, but each time, the case had quietly disappeared into administrative silence. This time, there was no burying it. Cross stood outside the cell, breathing carefully. Even from the corridor, something felt off. The lighting inside was brighter than the surrounding wing, a constant white glare that never dimmed. The ventilation grill rattled faintly, pushing out air that felt stale and oddly warm. "How long was he in there?" she asked. 46 hours, the warden replied. Inmate name, Daniel Reyes. Nonviolent offense. Prior disciplinary write-ups for noncompliance. Medical clearance? Cleared. Cross glanced at the observation log. Guards reported Reyes pacing the first night. Sitting against the wall the second. Then nothing. No noise. No movement. No requests through the door slot. The last entry read, "Inmate unresponsive. Entered cell." That was when they discovered he was gone. Cross stepped inside. The door sealed behind her with a heavy metallic thud that echoed longer than it should have. The temperature hit her immediately, not extreme, but inconsistent. Warm near the floor. Cold at shoulder height. The lights buzzed faintly overhead, never flickering, never dimming. She moved slowly, noticing details others might miss. The lack of shadows. The way sound seemed to flatten, as if the cell swallowed echoes. The vent pushed air, but not enough. Not for a human body meant to breathe here for days. She crouched and ran a finger along the wall. Dustless. Someone had wiped it recently. Cross straightened. This cell was cleaned after the inmate disappeared. The warden frowned. Standard procedure. Not before an investigation, she replied. In the corner, she noticed something else. A small mark scratched into the metal bed frame. Not graffiti. Not a tally. A word. Stop. Her pulse tightened. Cross requested the historical files on Cell 9. The warden hesitated, just long enough to be noticeable, before approving the request. Hours later, she sat in a records room flipping through yellowed incident reports from the 1980s and 1990s. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Short stays. Psychological breakdowns. Emergency removals. Inmates transferred out with no explanation. And always the same phrase repeated in guard notes. Inmate unable to tolerate conditions. But one report stopped her cold. An internal memo dated 1987. Cell 9 to remain operational. Modifications denied. Do not log environmental irregularities. Higher authority directive. Higher authority. Cross closed the file slowly. This cell hadn't failed inspections by accident. It had been kept this way. As she stood to leave, a junior officer entered the room, face pale. "Ma'am, we found something." He handed her a folded piece of paper recovered from the laundry chute connected to segregation. It wasn't a note. It was a medical request form, stamped and signed. The time was marked, day 3 to 2:17 a.m. Reyes had never made it to day 3. Cross felt the weight of the realization settle in. Someone had filed paperwork from inside a cell no one survived past 72 hours. And whoever did it didn't want that cell shut down. By the time Evelyn Cross returned to the segregation wing, segregation cell 9 had already started to attract the wrong kind of attention. Not from inmates, they had learned long ago to pretend the cell didn't exist, but from administration. Doors that once opened without resistance now required multiple approvals. Files she had accessed the night before were suddenly under review. That alone told her she was close. Cross stood in the control booth, watching the live feed from cell 9. The camera angle was fixed, too fixed, no blind spots, no shadows. Constant light. Constant exposure. The kind of environment that robbed the mind of rest long before it touched the body. "How long has that light been on?" she asked the booth officer. The man checked the panel. "Always. It doesn't cycle." Cross frowned. "Even during power conservation hours?" "Doesn't apply to cell 9. She requested environmental readings. Temperature, airflow, sound levels. The printout arrived minutes later, and it didn't make sense. The numbers fell within acceptable ranges, but they fluctuated constantly, minute shifts every few seconds. Too small to trigger alarms. Too frequent for a human nervous system to ignore. Sensory erosion. Cross visited medical next. Daniel Reyes' file sat in a stack marked transferred. No incident photos. No psychological evaluation post-removal. No discharge notes. "Where did Reyes go?" she asked the nurse supervisor. The woman hesitated. "He didn't." Cross waited. "He collapsed during relocation," the nurse finally said. "Before he reached intake. They moved him off-site." "Where?" "I wasn't told." That answer repeated itself everywhere Cross went. The more she dug, the more the system closed ranks. Then she found the other names. Cell 9 wasn't random. Every inmate placed inside shared subtle similarities. Compliant enough to avoid violent classification, mentally stable on intake, no history of self-harm. They were testable, observable, replaceable. Cross pulled archival blueprints and overlaid them with modern schematics. Cell 9's layout differed by inches, not enough to notice casually, but enough to matter. Its vent angled downward instead of across. Its lighting panel was wired directly into the backup grid, bypassing dimming protocols. And its walls contained older insulation materials no longer used elsewhere in the facility. She returned to the cell that evening, accompanied by maintenance supervisor Paul Hennick, a man who had worked at the prison since the late 1980s. His gait slowed as they approached the door. "I told them not to put people back in here," he muttered. Cross turned. "You knew." Hennick nodded once. Everyone knew. But knowing and stopping it aren't the same thing. Inside the cell, Hennick pointed to the ceiling panel. "That hum? It's not just ventilation. It's vibration. Low level. Barely audible. But constant." Cross closed her eyes for a moment. The sound pressed against her skull like a thought she couldn't finish. "Why keep it operational?" she asked. Hennick swallowed. Back then, the idea was control without marks. Break resistance. Force compliance. They called it behavioral conditioning. Who approved it? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. Federal consultants. Outside oversight. Grants tied to compliance metrics. Cross felt a cold wave of anger settle in her chest. So when inmates begged to leave, they were labeled unstable, Hennick said. Easier to discredit them than fix the cell. That night, Cross reviewed the medical request form again. Day 3. 2:17 a.m. Reyes never reached day 3, officially. Unless he had. She cross-checked timestamps against the power grid logs. A maintenance window occurred that same night. Cameras went offline for 12 minutes. Officially for system recalibration. Unofficially, anything could happen in 12 minutes. Cross accessed the storage archives beneath medical. Old equipment. Decommissioned stretchers. She found a transport log stamped but unsigned. Destination, specialized facility, external. No address. No receiving signature. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Stop digging. Seconds later, another. The cell works. Cross stared at the screen, pulse steadying instead of racing. Whoever was watching her didn't want exposure. They wanted continuation. She backed up her files and sent copies to an external secure server. Then she returned to segregation one last time before dawn. Inside cell 9, she noticed something new. A second mark on the bed frame, etched beneath the first. 2 words this time. They know. Cross stepped back, understanding crashing down on her. Reyes hadn't disappeared. He had been removed before he broke. And someone was making sure cell 9 stayed exactly the way it was. By the time Evelyn Cross realized how deep cell 9's reach went, it was already too late to stop quietly. The secure server confirmed what her instincts already knew. Within minutes of uploading the files, access attempts began hitting the system, not crude hacks, but credential-based logins routed through government networks. Someone with authority wasn't trying to erase the evidence anymore. They were trying to control it. Cross didn't sleep that night. She returned to the prison before sunrise, passing through layers of security that suddenly felt performative. Guards nodded too quickly. Doors opened a second longer than usual. The building wasn't hostile, it was cautious. Inside segregation, cell 9 waited exactly as she'd left it. Right? Humming. Empty. She requested authorization to shut the cell down for environmental testing. The denial came back in under 3 minutes. Request rejected. Cell operational. No explanation. Cross bypassed procedure and called Paul Hennick directly. He answered on the second ring. They're panicking, he said. Which means you're right. I need access to the original contractors, she replied. The ones from the 80s. There was a pause. Those records were sealed. Nothing stays sealed forever. Hennick met her off-site, in a storage annex few staff remembered existed. Inside, they uncovered a locked filing cabinet tagged with an obsolete agency code. The files inside were thin, intentionally so, but one memo stood out. A directive titled Operational Stress Tolerance Assessment. Cell 9 wasn't a punishment cell. It was a measuring device. Inmates placed inside weren't meant to survive comfortably. They were meant to demonstrate how long a human could endure disorientation without visible injury. Lighting cycles, sound vibrations, thermal inconsistencies, all tuned just enough to stay within acceptable limits while eroding perception and judgment. And the 72-hour threshold wasn't a myth. It was the maximum tolerance point. Beyond it, outcomes became unpredictable. Cross returned to medical and demanded access to off-site transfer data. This time, the resistance was open. A senior administrator blocked her path and spoke carefully, like every word was being weighed. Cell 9 is part of an old compliance program, he said. It's dormant. Dormant programs don't take new inmates, Cross replied. And they don't move people without records. The man leaned closer. You need to decide how much you want to know. Cross already knew the answer. That afternoon, she finally traced the external facility listed on the transport log. It wasn't a hospital. It was a private behavioral assessment center operating under a defense subcontract, one that no longer officially existed. Daniel Reyes had been sent there alive. Removed before day 3. Because he had adapted. The medical request form wasn't a plea for help. It was a report. He had recognized the pattern, understood the environment, maintained enough clarity to request evaluation instead of breaking. That made him valuable. Cross released the files. Not to the prison. Not to the agency. To the Public Oversight Board and 2 investigative journalists she trusted. The response was immediate. Audits. Suspensions. Emergency inspections across multiple states. Cell 9 was sealed within hours. The official statement cited outdated infrastructure concerns. No mention of testing. No mention of Reyes. But the damage was done. 3 weeks later, Cross received a padded envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A discharge summary. Daniel Reyes had been released from custody entirely. No charges pending. No explanation offered. His condition listed as stable. At the bottom of the page, handwritten in careful block letters, was a final note. I made it past 72. Cross folded the paper slowly. Cell 9 was empty now. Its lights finally dark. Its hum silenced. But as she stood outside the sealed door one last time, she understood the truth that no report would ever capture. Cell 9 didn't fail inmates. It revealed how easily suffering could be hidden behind compliance. And how many people were willing to look away. As long as the cell kept working. If you think the story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.